Alright, we are back with a new video, and today I want to talk a bit about Chapter 2 of MLP Make Your Mark. Now, I know I made a video a couple weeks ago about my general thoughts of G5 up to this point, and how I believe that the meat of the generation here, and the main thing I'll be basing my view of this generation on, will be about this series, which obviously recently dropped. Now, I had a debate with myself over how to cover these episodes, whether to do it like one video per episode where I just give my general thoughts, or do an episode ranking, or if I should just do what I'm going to be doing here, which is basically I'm just going to be going through the episodes, just doing like brief reviews of each of them, giving my general thoughts of what we've gotten so far. And I might do an episode ranking at some point once we get more episodes, but I feel like for now, it's probably just better to give my general thoughts while these episodes are still fresh in my mind. So that's what I'll be doing here. And to start off, we got episode 1 here, Izzy Does It, which is an interesting episode. Now, it's not the best one, and certainly a weird way to open up the series, with the main focus of the episode being Izzy wanting to like be more creative, I guess, where she makes this bracelet for Sunny's birthday, and then everyone else is just really impressed by it to the point where they want like her to start making one for them, like sort of suggesting that Izzy should start off of her own business. And a lot of the episodes just her just trying to make it all over again, only to come up short and getting creative block, and then eventually like making her own wagon, like really helping her get inspired and not really worrying as much about what others think. And again, this is your pretty standard episode for the most part. I mean, you have Pip giving some pretty awkward advice here about how she should just do what the fans want, and then her learning a lesson over the course of the episode about how that's actually really bad advice, which obviously. And then we do get our more formal introduction to Opaline here, along with Misty, her assistant, that she treats really poorly over the course of these episodes, and just getting to see this relationship play out more. But I feel like in this episode at least, I definitely felt like they could have done it a bit better. But in general, I feel like this episode was okay as a start, but certainly not my favorite. Then we get to episode 2 here, which honestly should have been the pilot, if I'm being perfectly honest, where a lot of the story and the ideas introduced here does seem to feel like a natural follow-up to the Make Your Mark special, with Hitch getting used to all the Earth ponies having their magic now, which, again, I did bring this up before, but I just find it really weird how this generation is pretending that Earth ponies never had magic before, even though it was stated throughout various G4 materials that Earth ponies were not only stronger than both unicorns and Pegasi, but also had a unique connection to the Earth, which made it easier for them to grow crops. So even though it wasn't as blatant as Pegasi or unicorns, Earth ponies still had their own unique powers. And the fact that the series here likes to pretend that this fact never really existed, and how the magic that they get here is some novel new creation, is pretty weird choice in my opinion. But obviously we see Hitch like getting pretty annoyed by it, and just seeing all the chaos that like the new magic is bringing about. And I like how Sprout here is shown to be in a pretty menial position right now, and he's pretty much a joke at this point. Now, granted, I kind of wish he got a bit more screen time here, but it is funny seeing him go from being this complete loser in a new generation to, I guess, being even more of a loser now. But it's also here that we see Hitch like try to ban magic altogether, and just him not really being open to anything in particular. And then by the end, he just kind of comes around to realizing that, hey, maybe the Earth ponies just need to learn how to hone their magic accordingly. And, you know, it is a pretty standard story for the most part, but along the way, we get probably the most notable moment of this series so far, and that being when they activate the crystals, and through that, they get a hologram message from Twilight Sparkle. And I'm not a huge fan of her design here, and I know people freaked out to a degree when they saw this moment in the trailer, which was obviously trailer bait here, but we see her have this whole complete message to the main five here about how there's an evil pony lurking and how she created the crystals, which does reinforce the backstory that was given in issue 2 of the comics, which states that Twilight did in fact create the crystals due to events that happened during the main six's lifetime. And I guess I'll just say this now, as it is alluded to in other episodes, but I'm not a huge fan of the fact that the whole issues that this G5 world have stem from things that happened during the main six's lifetime, where we learn that obviously during Twilight's rule that we had all this division breakout, and as we see later, Opaline, the main antagonist of this series, was a pretty critical figure here who was around during Twilight's lifetime and really helped stoke this division to the point where Twilight created the crystals. And we even see over time how that decision to split the magic into crystals helped contribute to the ponies drifting apart. And I'm just not a huge fan of that aspect to it, sort of indicating how this is all kind of Twilight's fault and indicating that their story like ultimately ended with them making a big mistake, which again, to bring it back to the Star Wars analogy, isn't really ideal in that it kind of retroactively indicates that the characters went on to have lives in which they made mistakes that in turn lead to future problems, which again, I kind of understand it from a story perspective of how it shows how life goes on. But I feel like given how far in the future we are and just how removed we are from the relics of G4 Equestria, that we could have plausibly just gotten a backstory of showing how Twilight really was a good leader and how she led Equestria through a long period of prosperity. But then just as the generations piled on and new princesses came and went, that they just forgot those lessons and how that led to a more natural drifting apart as opposed to this more brute force thing that is directly linked to Twilight's lifetime. And in fact, I actually thought it might have been interesting if maybe Opaline was just this descendant future ruler down the line, or at least someone that challenged like a ruler further down the line than Twilight, but then was just banished due to her gimmicks and stuff like that. So I feel like there's a way they could have done this and still connected to G4. And obviously, with the revelation that the stuff that happened in Twilight's lifetime did contribute to all these problems that we're seeing now in G5, can be traced back to her. So I'm not really a huge fan of that aspect to it. But it's through that we do like see the message and how they need to make sure that this pony Opaline doesn't really get access to the magic now that it's been reactivated, which obviously stirs this whole mystery. And obviously we know what the mystery is. We know that Opaline is the one behind it all, and that Misty is the one trying to ensure that they get the magic back to Opaline so that she can enact her evil plan or whatever. But even so, it is something that to keep in mind for future episodes. But on the whole, I did find this to be an okay episode, and one in which I felt like it probably should have been the pilot again, if I'm being perfectly honest, but that's just the way they rolled it out. But again, it's a good enough episode. Now moving on to episode 3, Portrait of a Princess, which actually ended up being my favorite episode of this group here, where a lot of it really focused on Pip and Zip's relationship here, where obviously the main story involves Pip trying to get ready for her portrait day while Zip just couldn't care less. And a lot of it seems to focus on Zip trying to get Pip to skip out on it by like luring her away to get to this flower that only blossoms once every 10 years. And all this is under the guise of making sure that like Pip can like grab it so that she can have it for Queen Haven to have in her portrait, which is a pretty interesting lie. But we also have Pip being pretty active on her social media, which obviously is part of her character per se, but she really goes all in by trying to like upload everything and live stream everything, even though they were sneaking out while they were supposedly getting makeovers at the salon, and Queen Haven would very easily find out that they had slipped away if she were constantly posting. So we do see the tension build up there to a degree. And then this is all part of a plan by Misty in order to get the princesses trapped in there in order to make them go away, which didn't make a whole ton of sense to me, as it's never explained what benefit Opaline would get out of this, other than maybe trying to get a ransom out of them and maybe trying to stir division that way. But I feel like all that would do is generate a ton of attention in terms of them trying to find like the two princesses and wondering how this could have happened and stuff. So which again, a lot of this could have easily backfired, but it doesn't seem to do so in this episode. But really the main focus here is about Zip and Pip and how they continually get on each other's nerves to the point where they break out into this massive argument. And obviously, once they get trapped in a cave, they do have their reconciliation. The two of them realize how Portrait Day is something that means a lot to Pip, which does make me feel a bit bad for Pip here. And at the same time, we see Zip sort of like growing a bit more distant from Pip over time. And we get this really good shot towards the end when they do finally come around and have their portrait day. And we see like the line of portraits, one in which they were fillies, and they were pretty happy around each other. Then there's another one from when they were a little bit older, and it's pretty clear that they're distant and like on each other's nerves. And then the one that we just get of them, like now that they're adults and now they're pretty happy, just showing like how their relationship has evolved over time. And plus, this episode has a pretty good song as well, particularly the one that they sing while they're in the cave, the one that they used to sing when they were younger. And I do like that like version of it with the guitar and stuff. Like it feels pretty wholesome, all things considered. So at the end of the day, I did find this to be my favorite episode of the bunch, and one that definitely had the most going on. And obviously, that leads to it being my favorite of the bunch so far. Then we get to episode 4, Alicorn, which I'm a bit more conflicted on, in my opinion, where it is sort of interesting in some regards, like how we see Sunny still kind of not being well respected on her own, and that a lot of the ponies in Maritime Bay only respect her when she turns into her Alicorn mode, which is a little weird because on one hand it does show how like Sunny herself isn't listened to that much and that they really just care that it's an Alicorn. But it's also like whenever we see Sunny in her normal Earth pony form and no one really cares, like, don't they realize that this is the same pony? Like, do they think that when she turns into an Alicorn, like she's just a completely different individual? And how does her having her wings out and her horns out make her any different than when she's just going about her business? Like, you clearly know that she's capable of turning into this like super mode or whatever. So what makes this any different? So I get what they're trying to communicate here, but I just found the whole implementation of it to be really confusing, if you ask me. But the story itself, like, they do have some cool ideas, like how Sunny is trying to use this clout in order to promote her causes, like getting her own community garden, getting people to eat healthier, which I do get to a degree, and it is pretty interesting seeing that play out. But at the same time, we also see Misty, like, use another scheme in order to get into Sunny's like ear per se, and trying to get her to reveal more about her Alicorn background to potentially get more information to Opaline. But then ultimately that fails as she storms out the stage before she can ultimately like speak to the public on anything. And by the end, we get your usual like Opaline like getting mad at Misty over failing and stuff like that. But on the whole, I did find this episode to be, again, okay, like it had its moments, and I do like the ideas that it was going for, but I just found the whole execution of it to be pretty weird and didn't really work out too well for it. Now moving on to episode 5, which is the Cutie Mark Mixup. And again, this episode is pretty standard for your most part, where it really just feels like a worse version of episodes we got from G4, such as Magical Mystery Cure and A Royal Problem, where the whole premise is Sunny and Hitch having their cutie marks switched, and then spending the episode trying to do each other's tasks, per se, only to completely come up short there. And I did find a lot of the implication here to be pretty weird, where obviously we see Hitch trying to run Sunny's smoothie business only to not know anything about making smoothies or talking to people while they're making them, and just not knowing her customer base very well. And then we see Sunny like trying to lay down the law, but then just completely getting pushed around. So again, I did feel like a worse version of those episodes, which did delve into more existential questions than this one did. This just feels like your typical story of, oh, you think you have it worse than me? Then why don't you spend a day in my shoes and stuff like that? So I did find that aspect to be pretty underwhelming. And honestly, I just found this to be pretty boring for the most part. It was probably the least entertaining episode of the bunch for me, and not really one that sticks to my mind super well. Now moving on to episode 6, which is the traditional unicorn sleepover, and this episode was definitely more interesting than the previous two in that it does focus more on world building, but also is more of a character piece on Misty, as we definitely learn more about her background. Now obviously I haven't mentioned this before, but we did learn from earlier episodes that Misty is basically an orphan, and that Opaline rescued her when she was younger. Again, it's not really explained like her backstory. Hopefully, we'll learn more about that in future episodes. But we do know that Opaline is essentially her adopted mother, which is interesting considering how poorly Opaline treats her in these episodes. But we also learned that Misty doesn't really have much of a background, at least in terms of her like growing up in unicorn culture, where a lot of this episode is her pretending like she grew up in Bridalwood and that she knows all these traditions that Izzy knows when she's trying to run her traditional unicorn sleepover, but it's just completely like missing the mark there, which draws Zip's suspicion for a lot of it. But it's also Misty like getting her first chance at actual friendship and learning more about the others, which obviously did seem pretty obvious coming into it, where we obviously saw Misty in the trailer being like her assistant to Opaline, and it was pretty blatant even before episode 1 that she is being set up for a redemption arc here where she learns more about friendship the more time that she spends around the main five. And obviously we are starting to get that here where Misty is starting to spend more time with them and really just trying to make do and trying to fit in, only to come up short there. And then obviously we get to probably one of the more notable scenes in the episode where Sunny decides to tell the story of the legend of Equestria, which again is another way to reinforce the backstory that we've gotten into from issue 2 of the comics, but also from episode 2 of the series. But this time we get a bit more expansion upon it, where obviously we know that Twilight was the one to like create the crystals and really stave off this threat against Equestria's unity. But obviously we get some more details here, like the fact that this was triggered by an earth pony getting hurt by a unicorn, which really felt like a weird catalyst for this whole crisis to ensue, considering the fact that like Equestria had been around for thousands of years, and I'm sure there have been countless incidents of like other ponies like engaging each other, being violent with each other. So I feel like this definitely deserves a bit more context. And something does tell me that Opaline may have triggered this, maybe have triggered this like race-based thing. So I guess there's that. But then more importantly, we see how after like the unicrystals were created, that really sparked this whole drifting apart where supposedly, even though that this unity crystal thing really helped to stop the violence per se, it also like didn't really do much to bring ponies back together, and in turn it caused them to just drift apart. And I do find the explanation to be a bit underwhelming, again just tracing all this division back to the main six's lifetime from G4, which again is pretty underwhelming. But then we get this quick interlude from Misty about how she has a different version of the story, about how you had this powerful Alicorn queen from whom most of Equestria's magic originated, and the ponies were just jealous of the Alicorn's power and they wanted it for themselves, which prompted Twilight to stop Opaline and really strip her of her magic, which is an interesting interpretation of the story and definitely helps provide some additional context there. But again, the fact that they are tracing this all back to the main six's lifetime is still pretty underwhelming. And I am kind of hoping we get some more clarification in future episodes, which honestly, considering the amount of time that they've already invested in the backstory, I feel like we'll probably get some more details as the story goes along anyway. But anyway, we do see Misty eventually try to steal the lantern, only to come up short, and she does this by burying it in the garden with the hopes of picking it up when she leaves the following morning, which obviously leads directly into the next episode, which is Who've Done It, which again is an immediate follow-up to the traditional unicorn sleepover, where they see that the lantern has gone missing. However, I did find this a bit underwhelming in that we see Pip like be the one to find the lantern after it went missing, but then rather than tell Zip about it immediately, she decides, oh, I'm gonna keep the mystery going for as long as possible. So she takes the lantern for herself and she leaves a clue to send Zip down the trail, and she justifies this by saying that, oh, I like Zip when she's a detective, like it causes her cutie mark to glow and it makes her feel full of purpose, which honestly I'm a bit surprised that didn't lead to some greater conflict. Like, I feel like if this were a different show, that this would have been the impetus for like something where Zip finds out at the end she gets mad at Pip for endangering like Maritime Bay and all Equestria, and that this lantern could have been lost or ended up in the wrong Who's. Just to name an example, I mean, we saw this on Steven Universe in Cry for Help. In that episode, we saw that Peridot had set up this communication hub in order to send a distress signal to Yellow Diamond, which causes the crystal gems to knock it down, mainly by causing Pearl and Garnet to fuse into Sardonyx. And Pearl is just so happy by this fusion. She feels so fulfilled that she keeps going back to the communication hub after they tore it down, rebuilding it just for the purpose of so that they can go back and she can fuse again as Garnet into Sardonyx so that they can keep knocking it down, because she just feels so powerful when she's Sardonyx. And at the end, when she gets exposed, like Garnet gets really mad at her, not only for endangering the Earth by making it easier for Peridot to send messages to Yellow Diamond, but also due to the fact that she was manipulating Garnet and the fact that she was manipulating fusion, which is such an important part of her identity. And the fact that Pearl was just doing it for her own self-gain was something that really upset her, and it really stuck for the next couple episodes. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that this show should have done that, but it did make me think that maybe Zip should have been a bit more upset that like Pip was being so careless with the lantern, like how she was putting the fate of all of Equestria potentially in danger just to make her feel a little better, and something really small. So I don't know, that just was just a weird thing for me. But the other notable moment is right at the end, where it did seem like Misty was about to spill the beans and really take all the fault for taking the lantern, and in turn expose to the main five the fact that she probably isn't up to no good. But then Pip takes the fall. She admits that she was the one to take the lantern, that she basically sent everyone on this wild goose chase over nothing, all while clearing Misty's name in the process and really kicking the can down the road for them finding out that Misty is evil and that Misty would feel bad for betraying the main five's trust, which again would probably accelerate her redemption arc here. But still, it was a fine enough episode, and while I did find it to be underwhelming compared to the previous episode, where we did see glimpses of Misty like bonding more with the main five and starting to get the first taste of friendship, this was an okay enough episode, and it was interesting to see the traditional Unicorn Sleepover get this sort of follow-up. And finally, we have episode 8, which is Have You Seen This Dragon?, which is fine. I mean, a lot of it was just Misty, like, getting involved in shenanigans with Sparky after she kidnaps him, and for whatever reason, like, she keeps him in the basement of the Bright House, even though for much of the episode, the main five are outside of the house, and it really just shows, like, how Misty didn't really have a long-term plan here, and how she really had no hope of escaping, like, this, like, crime untouched, which obviously isn't great in that she is unable to get Sparky, although she does manage to get like a dragon flame before escaping, so at least there's that. But a lot of it is also like plenty of slapstick with Misty trying to get around all the like obstacles and traps that Sparky sets up, all while we have Detective Zip doing more of her stuff, and then her eventually figuring out that, oh, well, all of Sparky's pictures have him in his blankie, and the fact that he doesn't have his blankie means that he was kidnapped. And again, this episode is just kind of fine. I mean, they find Sparky. Misty, again, somehow doesn't get caught, which I did find a bit strange. And then we get that scene towards the end where Misty goes to Opaline, gives her the dragon flame, and then Opaline just yells at her again, saying how she's a continual failure and stuff like that. And we get a brief moment where it's too much for Misty, and she says, you know, for someone so hot, how can you be so cold? And then she starts crying, which, again, is a nice moment. But on the whole, this episode is just kind of fine. Didn't really stand out too much for me. And again, is not one of the better episodes in my opinion. So with that, that wraps up chapter 2 of Make Your Mark, which, again, I did find to be mostly alright. Now, admittedly, there were some slower episodes in there, but there were a couple of pretty good ones, particularly Portrait of a Princess and the traditional Unicorn Sleepover, which were my standouts in my personal opinion. Now, talking more generally about the series so far, I mean, it does still have a lot of the same issues as the Make Your Mark special with the pretty bad animation. Mind you, it is something I am getting a bit more used to the more that I watch it. I mean, it's still not good, but there are still some moments where I can stomach it a bit better than what I could at the time the special came out, so there's that. For the music, I mean, it was pretty good for the most part. Again, there are some standout songs in here, but again, nothing that stands out too much. I mean, the characters are fine, I guess. I mean, Opaline and Misty have a pretty interesting dynamic where, yes, on one hand, we are setting up a redemption arc for Misty with how poorly Opaline's been treating her, but I do like a lot of the jokes that Opaline gives, like how Misty is trying to suck up to her only for Opaline to push back, saying, oh, don't be pandering, or oh, don't be like that and stuff. I mean, stuff like that is pretty amusing for the most part. And again, I still walk away from this feeling somewhat good about the series. Now, obviously, we'll have to wait and see the next batch of episodes when they come out. But again, in the meantime, I'm pretty happy with what we got, even despite some issues that I alluded to earlier. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. Now again, I'll be back soon talking about this series again, so stay tuned for that. And I have other content based on other shows that I like, so stay tuned for coverage on that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server. I'll leave a link to join in the description. A lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that's the video. See ya.